The treadmill was still moving when Senior Assessor Drevathon leaned across the monitoring console and told me, very quietly, that they had never had to do this before. I asked what this was. He said, "Extend the protocol past stage 3. He said it with the same inflection a person uses when they're describing something that isn't happening in front of them, something they're watching on a recording of another day. Clinical removal, professional distance. I recognized it because I'd used the same tone for most of my career, the voice researchers use when the data has become genuinely, structurally surprising and they do not yet have a framework for the surprise. I kept running. The treadmill incline was at 9 degrees. It had been at 9 degrees for 22 minutes, which was stage 3's sustained load window, and the readout on the arm panel showed my heart rate at 164, my blood lactate at 4.8 millimoles per liter, my respiratory rate at 28 cycles per minute, all of which were by the Vethori Compact's own reference charts, well within the zone the board called pre-sealing. Not sealing, pre-sealing. That was the problem. I should explain what I was doing there. The Vethori Interspecies Assessment Compact had been benchmarking biological species for, by their calendar, roughly 411 years. They had a protocol, the Calibration Suite Protocol, 5 stages of escalating physical demand, which they used to establish what they called the species ceiling, the point at which a subject's physiology triggered its own automatic shutdown cascade, the body's terminal mechanism for preventing catastrophic damage. Every species in the compact's records reached ceiling. The only variable was which stage. The Thurveth reached ceiling in stage 1, which the compact's literature described with the kind of careful neutrality that made it obvious the Thurveth found this embarrassing. The Orician reached ceiling in stage 2. Most bipedal oxygen-metabolizing species reached ceiling somewhere in stage 2 or early stage 3. The Vethori themselves, the species that had designed the protocol, peaked in late stage 3. They had done so reliably across 411 years of self-testing, their own researchers and military personnel and endurance athletes, their biological ceiling sitting at the same coordinates like a wall. They were proud of this in their way. It meant the protocol was well calibrated. The wall was real. The protocol found it every time. I was a physiologist. I had published, before the compact's invitation arrived, 11 peer-reviewed papers on human anaerobic threshold adaptation, 3 on cortisol response curves under sustained load, and 1, my most cited, my most argued about, on the neurochemical architecture of what I called the human refusal window, the documented phenomenon in which human subjects, at the point where all metabolic indicators should predict the cessation of voluntary effort, instead continue. Not because they choose to, in any meaningful volitional sense, because the body's chemistry does not, in that moment, produce the signal that would stop them. That paper was why the invitation arrived. The compact's liaison, a slender Vethori named Pelth Savarn, who had the patient, careful quality of someone who had spent decades translating difficult things for audiences that did not want to hear them, had read the paper 3 times, he told me. He had passed it to the assessment board. The board had asked, through Pelth Savarn, whether I would be willing to be the first human subject run through the Calibration Suite Protocol, not as a research collaboration, not as a diplomatic gesture. They wanted a ceiling reading. They wanted, as Pelth Savarn put it with admirable straightforwardness, to know where we ended. I said yes. My department head, Dr. Renata Kovalov, had looked at me across her desk when I told her and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Take your own monitoring kit." I did. The calibration suite itself was not what I expected. I had imagined something cold and institutional, a facility designed to process subjects efficiently and extract data without ceremony. What I found instead was a room that felt like a cathedral built by engineers. The ceiling was high, perhaps 18 meters, and the walls were paneled in a polished blue-gray material that caught the light from the ceiling arrays and held it, giving the whole space a quality of diffuse illumination, as if the light were generated by the room itself rather than any specific source. The treadmill was positioned at the center of the floor on a raised platform, and around it, in a wide arc of tiered seating, sat the assessment board. 7 of them, plus 2 observers from the Peleth Institute who had, I was told, requested the addition of their seats when word circulated that the subject was human. They wore the compact's formal assessment attire, close-fitted robes in a deep charcoal, with the compact's sigil embroidered at the collar in silver thread, and they had the look of people who had done this many times and found it entirely routine. Senior Assessor Drevathan was at the center of the arc, directly in front of the treadmill platform, his monitoring console folded open. He introduced each member of the board by title. I shook hands, or made the equivalent gesture the compact's cultural briefing had prepared me for, and then we got to work. The pre-stage physical assessment took 40 minutes. They ran a full biological scan. I watched the holographic readout build above the console in layers, my own physiology translated into compact notation, the systems color-coded and labeled. Cardiovascular, respiratory, musculoskeletal, neurochemical, endocrine. The scan took each system and compared it against the compact's master reference archive, the accumulated biological data of every species assessed across 4 centuries, and generated a predicted ceiling probability distribution for each stage of the protocol. I remember watching the distribution columns appear above the console as the scan completed, and I remember that the room was very quiet in a particular way when they did. Not the quiet of people not speaking, the quiet of people choosing, deliberately, not to react to something in front of them. My stage 2 ceiling probability was listed as 43%. My stage 3 ceiling probability was listed as 91%. Stage 4 and Stage 5 were listed as research margin entries. The compact's notation for possibilities, so remote they existed only as statistical courtesy, numbers too small to carry predictive weight. The equivalent, I thought, of writing lightning strike in a weather forecast. Drevathan walked me through the ceiling probability display with the careful thoroughness of a professional who takes his subject's right to full information seriously. He explained what each stage required. He explained what the shutdown cascade looked like on the instruments, a sharp inflection in the lactate curve, a cortisol surge, a simultaneous drop in voluntary motor output, the body pulling the subject off the machine by chemistry rather than will. He was very clear and very kind, and I understood that he was telling me all of this because he expected, based on 411 years of accumulated species data, that I would reach my ceiling in Stage 3, and that I would need to understand what was happening to me when I did. I thanked him. I stepped onto the treadmill. Stage 1 began. Stage 1 is a warm-up by the compact's design, a 10-minute window at an incline of 3 degrees, and a pace the compact's reference tables describe as brisk ambulation for bipedal species of standard limb proportion. I walked it. My heart rate climbed to 98. The board made notes. The Peleth observers, whose names were Vethori Seln and Orath Dim, leaned forward slightly in their seats at the 4-minute mark when my lactate reading held flat instead of climbing the expected curve. Drevathan made a note. Nobody said anything. Stage 2 began with an incline increase to 5 degrees and a pace shift from walking to running. The compact's literature on Stage 2 is detailed. They've run it on more species than any other single stage, because most of their data is Stage 2 data. It's where the distribution is richest. It's where the room, in my experience of reading compact literature before the assessment, expects things to get interesting. For me, Stage 2 was a tempo run. I had done tempo runs 3 times a week for most of my adult life. The incline was manageable, the pace was inside my aerobic threshold, and the only unusual element was the monitoring hardware. The sensors at my wrists and sternum feeding data to the console in real time. The holographic readout updating every 4 seconds, and the 9 pairs of Vethori eyes tracking the numbers as they came in. At the 12-minute mark of stage 2, Drevathon spoke for the first time since the protocol began. "Dr. Solis," he said, "your lactate level is 2.1 millimoles per liter." I said I knew. He said that for a stage 2 subject at the 12-minute mark, the reference ceiling for lactate was 4.2 millimoles. I was at half the reference ceiling. I said that was about right for me at this pace. He made a note. The Peleth observer on the left, Vethory-Selm, whose role I understood to be documentation rather than active assessment, wrote something on her tablet that she then showed to Orath-Dim. He read it and looked up at the treadmill platform with the expression of someone revising a mental model they had been confident in until 30 seconds ago. Stage 2 ended. The ceiling cascade had not occurred. My stage 2 ceiling probability had been 43%. I had passed through it. The board member directly to Drevathon's left, a senior assessor named Vethory-Spell, whose specialty, I'd been told in the pre-session briefing, was cardiovascular ceiling mechanics, leaned across the seating rail and spoke to Drevathon in the low, rapid exchange of two people comparing readings they are both looking at and cannot reconcile with each other. I watched them without appearing to watch them, the way you learn to observe professional disagreement from a polite distance when you spend enough years at research conferences. Orath-Dim, to my right in the observer section, had closed his tablet and was holding it flat in his lap, which I took to mean he was no longer taking documentary notes in the standard sense and was instead thinking about something. He was looking at the console display rather than at me, and his expression was the one I recognized from my own work, the concentrated attention of a researcher whose prior finding is being actively tested by new data and who has not yet decided which direction the testing is going. I had cited his rebuttal paper 47 times in subsequent work. Not dismissively, I had cited it because it was the most technically serious challenge to the receptor non-functionality hypothesis, and taking it seriously was the only way to answer it properly. His primary methodological objection had been that the receptor binding assay I had used in the 2019 study was insufficiently sensitive to detect TEM binding events at the low-activity end of the functional spectrum, and that what I had measured as absence might instead be subthreshold activity. It was a good objection. It had taken me 2 years of follow-up work to address it with the rigor it deserved. I had published the address in 2021 with a revised assay protocol that I believed closed the sensitivity gap. His response to the 2021 paper had been a short letter to the journal suggesting that 1 or 2 methodology questions remained open. This was not unusual in science. 2 or 3 methodology questions remain open in most findings worth having. You proceed anyway and the data accumulates. The data was, at this moment, accumulating rather dramatically. Drevathon consulted with Vethory-Spell and 2 of the board members to his left in a low, rapid exchange I did not catch. Then he looked up at me. "Stage 3, he said, "when you are ready." I told him I was ready now. The incline went a 9 degrees. The pace increased. Stage 3 is the compact's primary assessment stage, the one they designed with their own physiology in mind, the stage where Vethory subjects ceiling reliably. 18 minutes of sustained high-intensity load, the incline fixed, the pace demanding, the metabolic requirement calibrated to push every known bipedal species past its comfortable range and into the territory where the shutdown chemistry begins to build. I ran it. At the 6-minute mark of stage 3, my blood lactate was at 3.8, elevated, comfortable within my training range, unremarkable by human athletic standards. Vethory-Spell made a short verbal notation. The compact's assessors spoke their observations into a recording system rather than writing them, and I could hear, without distinguishing words, the quiet cadence of a professional describing something that is not yet alarming but is requiring description. At the 10-minute mark, it was at 4.2. the reference ceiling value Drevathon had cited for stage 2. I heard someone in the board seating shift their position. I did not look up. The monitor on my arm showed 161 heart rate, 26 respiratory cycles, the lactate figure holding steady rather than continuing to spike. Steady at 4.2 meant I had reached a metabolic equilibrium at a level that should, in the compact's model, be triggering precascade chemistry. Precascade was the stage before the shutdown signal. The fact that I was at equilibrium rather than accelerating toward it meant the precascade chemistry was not building. It meant the process had no next step, not delayed, absent. Drevathon made a notation. I heard him say a number 4.2, and then say something else I couldn't distinguish, and then there was a longer pause in the recording pattern than there had been before. At the 14-minute mark, it was at 4.6. My heart rate was 161. My respiratory rate was 26. All of these numbers were, for me, what I would describe to a human colleague as a solid training load. Demanding, sustainable. At the 18-minute mark, the end of stage 3's sustained load window, Drevathon leaned across the console and told me they had never had to extend the protocol past stage 3. I kept running. What happened next, I think, requires some explanation of the physiology, because without it the board's reaction may seem disproportionate. They were not, to be clear, panicking. Vethori assessment board members do not panic in session. But there is a quality of stillness that settles into a room when the model that everyone in the room has been using to predict the next several minutes turns out to be wrong. And that quality had settled into the calibration suite at stage 3's end, and had not lifted. The shutdown cascade is, across every species the compact has assessed, a neurochemical event. It is not a matter of pain or fatigue in the colloquial sense, or the mental state of wanting to stop. It is a cascade. The body, at a predictable threshold of accumulated metabolic stress, releases a set of neurochemical signals. The compact's literature calls the primary signal the terminal effort marker, or TEM, which bind to receptors in the motor cortex and the autonomic regulation centers, and trigger what the literature describes as physiological effort cessation. The involuntary drop in voluntary motor output, the body pulling its subject off the machine not by choice, but by chemistry. The shutdown is not requested, it is issued. The subject does not decide to stop, the subject's own body stops them. This is universal. In 411 years and across every species assessed, several dozen, by the time of my assessment, the compact had never observed a subject whose body failed to issue the cascade. The cascade was, as far as anyone in the compact's research archive had been able to determine, a fundamental feature of oxygen metabolizing life. The mechanism by which biology protects itself from catastrophic overexpenditure. Every species had it. The cascade's threshold varied. That was the whole point of the protocol, finding the threshold, but every species had it. The scan done before my assessment had looked for my TEM receptor sites. It had found receptor structures in approximately the right anatomical locations. The pre-assessment ceiling probability distribution had been calculated on the assumption that those receptor sites were functional, that my shutdown cascade would occur, that my TEM would bind, that my body would obey. At stage 3 plus 6 minutes, an extension the board had no reference data for because no subject had ever required it, Drevathon ran the scan again. I was still on the treadmill, 9 degrees same pace. Heart rate 164, lactate 4.8. The scan came back in 40 seconds. Drevathon looked at it for a moment before he said anything. He had the quality of a man reading a document that he has already read, looking for the sentence he thinks he must have misread the first time. He said, "Dr. Solis, your TEM receptor structures, they are present." I said yes. He said, "They are not binding." I said no, they weren't. He asked why. I told him that was what my 2019 paper was about. That was the paper with 11,000 citations and 147 responses, and a special issue of the Journal of Comparative Physiology dedicated to arguing about whether what I had found was real. That the human TEM receptor structures exist, that they are anatomically present, that they are, as far as anyone has been able to determine, non-functional. Not vestigial in the evolutionary sense. Not atrophied. Present, intact, and simply not active. As if whatever evolutionary pathway produced the shutdown cascade in every other oxygen-metabolizing species had, in humans, produced the architecture but not the wiring. I told him that I had, in that paper, described this finding as the most interesting physiological anomaly in human biology and the least understood. I had hypothesized 3 possible explanations. None of the 3 had been confirmed. The paper's conclusion was a question. What does an organism that cannot receive its own shutdown signal do instead? The answer, I told Drevathon, was that it kept running. He looked at me for a moment. Then he made a note. The note, I found out later, was a formal protocol extension request to the board, a procedural document, because the Compact's assessment rules require a formal vote to proceed past a stage that has exceeded its standard window. The board voted. 7-4-0 against. 2 abstentions from the Peleth observers who, as Institute affiliates rather than Compact members, were not eligible to vote on procedural extensions, but who, I was told, had both been making sustained notes since Stage 3's 12th minute. Stage 4 began. Stage 4 is not a stage that most Compact subjects ever see. It is in the protocol as a theoretical construct, a stress load calibrated for hypothetical species whose ceiling sits above the Vethori reference, and in 411 years it had been run exactly twice, both times on species whose physiology had presented outlier Stage 3 data that suggested a higher ceiling was possible. Both subjects had ceilinged inside Stage 4's first 6 minutes. The stage itself runs 25 minutes and escalates the incline to 14 degrees midway through, with a pace increase at the same point. Drevathon explained this to me. He was very thorough. I appreciated the thoroughness because it meant he had stopped being certain what was going to happen, and when Drevathon stopped being certain, he responded by becoming more thorough rather than less. I had the sense that this was a professional quality he had built over a long career, and that it was serving him well today. I asked whether the protocol had a word count limit on explanations. He looked at me. I told him I was ready. The incline went a 14 degrees at the midway mark and I felt it. There is no point in pretending otherwise. 14 degrees at running pace is a different thing than 9 degrees. The demand on the posterior chain is specific and considerable, and my lactate was already at 5.2 by the time the incline shift occurred, and when it did the number jumped to 6.1 inside 2 minutes. My heart rate was at 171. My respiratory rate was 32. I was, by any human physiological standard, working hard. I was not at ceiling. I had no ceiling to be at. At Stage 4's 16th minute, Vethori Selm, the Peleth documentation observer, asked Drevathon for permission to approach the monitoring console directly. He granted it. She stood at the console and looked at the readout for 30 seconds without speaking, and then she said in the careful, considered way of someone who spends their professional life choosing words precisely, "The TEM binding sites are showing 0 activity, not suppressed activity. 0. The signal is being generated. It is reaching the receptor structures. The structures are not responding." Drevathon said he was aware. She said, in 400 years of Compact records, the phrase TEM structures not responding does not appear, not as a category, not as a finding, not as a theoretical annotation. He said he was aware of that too. She looked at me on the treadmill. I was running. I gave her a small nod because it seemed like the appropriate thing to do under the circumstances. She looked at me for another moment and then walked back to her seat. Vetharispel had stopped making verbal notations. I noticed this because the rhythm of it had been a background presence since stage 2, and its absence had a quality, like a sound you've been hearing for a long time, stopping. He was watching the console display with both hands flat on his knees, the posture of a person who has decided that speaking is not what the moment requires. He had been the board's most technically active member in the early stages, the questions, the cross-references to the archive, the running commentary on the lactate curve. Now he was still. I understood why. When the data is moving into territory your notation system does not have terms for, you stop making notations. Stage 4 ended, 25 minutes. The cascade had not occurred. My measured lactate was 6.4, elevated, outside my comfortable training range, in a zone I would have described to a human colleague as hard but not catastrophic. My heart rate was 173. I was breathing at 34 cycles per minute. The board held a second vote, this one not procedural but, as Drevathan explained, under Article 17 of the Compact Assessment Charter, which governs assessments where standard protocol has been exhausted before a ceiling reading is obtained. Article 17, he told me, permitted the board to construct an ad hoc Stage 6, and beyond using whatever escalation parameters the board deemed appropriate, if Stage 5 also failed to produce a ceiling reading. He said this in the matter-of-fact tone of a person citing a regulation they have never cited before and expect never to cite again. And the phrasing, failed to produce a ceiling reading, landed in the room with a particular weight, because the regulation assumed the anomaly was the failure, and the ceiling was the expected outcome, and what was happening was the opposite. Stage 5 was the protocol's terminal stage. It had been run, to date, 0 times. It existed in the protocol as a failsafe. The Compact's designers had included it as a theoretical construct for subjects with outlier Stage 4 data which had never existed. The stage ran 30 minutes. The incline was 17 degrees. The pace was the protocol's maximum. And at the 20-minute mark, the protocol included what the Compact's literature called the saturation load, a 60-second sprint interval at maximum incline and maximum pace, designed as the definitive ceiling trigger, the single escalation beyond which no known biology could continue to generate voluntary effort. Nobody had ever run the saturation load. It had been designed to be run. It had never been run. Drevathan told me this with the expression of a man who has arrived at a sentence that was always theoretically in his vocabulary and has never expected to say it out loud. He described the saturation load the way you would describe a fire extinguisher, something built for an emergency, something you are glad exists, something you have never needed. He told me what would happen physiologically, using the Compact's models, if any known species attempted it. He described the shutdown cascade as it would appear on the monitoring console, the sharp lactate spike, the cortisol surge, the TEM binding event, the drop in motor output. He described it in detail because he was a thorough professional and because I was the subject and had the right to the information. I want to be clear about something. I was not dismissing the saturation load. I was not, as some of the post-publication commentary on the subsequent research papers suggested, demonstrating a human predisposition toward recklessness or toward ignoring warning signals. I was aware, very precisely, of what Stage 5 plus the saturation load would cost me. I had done the metabolic math. I knew what my lactate would look like, what my heart rate would climb to, what the 60 seconds of maximum effort would feel like in my posterior chain and my respiratory system after 40-some minutes of preceding accumulated load. I was not dismissing any of that. I was assessing it honestly and finding that it was acceptable, that the cost was one I was willing to pay for the data, and that there was no chemical in my body whose job it was to override that assessment and make the decision for me. That was exactly the finding. That was always the finding. I was living it in real time. I told him I understood the saturation load. He asked if I was ready. I said yes. Stage 5 began. The incline at 17 degrees is a different machine. The biomechanics shift from running to something closer to a powered climb, the stride shortening, the hip flexors taking on load that the treadmill's surface doesn't relieve. Within the first 3 minutes, my lactate was at 7.1. My heart rate was at 176. My posterior chain was doing work it understood very well. I had trained at gradient inclines specifically because the research on human eccentric strength adaptation had always fascinated me, but it was doing more of it than usual, and the cumulative effect of the preceding stages was present. I was aware of it. The awareness was information. It did not constitute a shutdown signal because there was no shutdown signal to constitute. At the 8-minute mark of stage 5, Orath Dim, the second Peleth observer, who had been largely silent across the preceding stages, making notes and watching the console, spoke for the first time. He said, "Dr. Solis, I have a question if the protocol permits." Drevathan looked at him, then at me. I said the protocol permitted. Orath Dim said, "My understanding of your prior research, the 2019 paper, and the 4 subsequent papers that directly address the TEM receptor anomaly, is that this finding has been contested in your field, that there are researchers who believe the anomaly is an artifact of the detection methodology, and that functional TEM receptors are present and active in humans, simply expressed differently than in other species." I said that was correct. He said, "Based on the data currently displayed on this console, what is your assessment of that position?" I looked at the readout. 7.1 lactate, 176 heart rate, stage 5, 8 minutes in, no ceiling cascade. My TEM structures sitting perfectly intact and perfectly silent in the scan, the shutdown signal arriving at them and dispersing into nothing, like water into sand. I said that I thought the data was fairly clear. Orath Dim made a note. He said, without looking up, "I was the lead author of the principal rebuttal paper to your 2019 study." I said I knew. I had cited the rebuttal in my 2021 follow-up, where I had addressed his methodology objections directly. He said, "You were correct." The room was quiet in the way it had been quiet at stage 3's end, but denser now, more accumulated. I ran. At the 17-minute mark, Drevathan said, 3 minutes to the saturation load." I said I was ready. He said, "Dr. Solis, I want to be certain you understand what the saturation load is designed to do. It is designed as a terminal trigger. It has been calibrated against the highest ceiling species data in the Compact's archives. It is, in the Compact's own classification, the absolute upper boundary of what any species' metabolism is expected to sustain." I told him I understood. He said, "Have you ever run an interval of this kind before?" I told him I had run 60-second maximum effort sprint intervals as a regular part of my training protocol for approximately 15 years. I told him the incline would be new, but the effort duration relationship was familiar. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the console. Then he said, with a quality in his voice I had not heard from him before, not alarm, not confusion, but something closer to a very careful openness, the sound of a mind that has just widened its aperture significantly and is still adjusting. In the Compact's 411-year assessment record, no species has entered the saturation load interval without a ceiling cascade having already occurred. The saturation load is designed to be a redundancy, a final measure for a subject who reached stage 4 or stage 5 but whose cascade was delayed. You will be the first subject to enter it without a prior cascade. I said, "How does it feel to run this assessment?" He said, "I was going to ask you the same question." I ran. The saturation load at full incline and full pace is, I will say this clearly, because it is accurate, the hardest physical thing I have ever done. 60 seconds of maximum effort at 17 degrees after 47 minutes of preceding load is an experience that exists in a register entirely its own. My lactate hit 8.9. My heart rate reached 183. My respiratory rate was 41 cycles per minute, and I was aware, in the pure uncomplicated physiological sense, of every muscle group involved, and the degree to which each one was operating at or near its instantaneous output limit. I did not receive a shutdown signal. There was nothing to receive. My TEM structures remained as they had been for the entire assessment, inert, not suppressed, not overwhelmed, not overridden, simply and structurally absent from the signal chain that every other species uses to end its own effort. My body was not ignoring the signal. It was not fighting the signal. It was doing what it had always done, what every human body has always done, generating effort without a terminal circuit, running an internal process that has no design stop point, only a continuous set of costs that the organism negotiates in real time, and that, in the absence of catastrophic damage or complete substrate depletion, does not automatically resolve into cessation. The 60 seconds ended. The saturation load was over. Stage 5's remaining 13 minutes passed. I ran them. My lactate normalized downward as the pace decreased for the stage's cool-down window. My heart rate dropped to 168, then 161, then 154 as the protocol wound toward its end. The room was very quiet. I was aware of the board in my peripheral vision, 7 figures in charcoal robes, and the 2 Peleth observers to their right, and Drevathan at the console directly in front of me, watching the readout with the expression of a man who is writing a report in his head and has arrived at a section he does not have the forms for. Stage 5 ended. The treadmill decelerated to a walking pace for the protocol's mandatory cool-down, and I walked it for 5 minutes, and my numbers came down the way they always do: lactate clearing, heart rate dropping, respiratory rate settling. And then Drevathan said, "Protocol complete." I stepped off the treadmill. The room was still very quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than the quiet at Stage 3's end, when the board had simply been recalibrating their expectations. This was the quiet of a room that had been running a process for 411 years, a process designed to produce a specific answer, and had just finished running it and received, for the first time in its history, no answer at all. The protocol was done. The console had data, excellent data, dense and complete, every system tracked and documented from start to finish. But the column where the ceiling reading should have appeared was empty. Not zero, not trace. Empty. The field existed, the instruments had been waiting for it, and the biology had simply never filled it in. I noticed that the 2 Peleth observers had both, at some point in the final minutes of Stage 5, moved from their individual note-taking postures to a shared one. They were seated slightly angled toward each other, their tablets together on the armrest between their chairs, one writing and the other speaking quietly. This was, I thought, not documentary behavior. This was the behavior of 2 scientists who have been sitting in different chairs, watching the same impossible thing, and have just decided that talking to each other about it is necessary. I picked up the towel from the platform rail. The compact staff had put one there, which I had appreciated, and I wiped my face and I looked at Drevathan and I asked him whether there was a Stage 6. He looked back at me. He looked at the console. He looked back at me. He said, "There is not." I said, "All right." I sat down on the platform's edge. My legs were tired in the way legs are tired after a long, hard effort, functional, specific, not alarming. I drank water. The cool-down physiological window was about what I would have expected. The board did not move. 7 of them, plus 2 observers, in a wide arc around the platform, and not one of them was writing anything or speaking to anyone else. They were looking at the console, or at me, or at the space between the console and the platform, as if somewhere in that space was the thing that was supposed to have happened and hadn't. Drevathan cleared his throat. He said, Dr. Solis, for the formal record, the Vethori Interspecies Assessment Compact Calibration Suite Protocol has been run to completion. All 5 standard stages have been completed. The ad hoc extension provisions of Article 17 have not been required because Stage 5 ran to completion. The subject has not been presented with a ceiling reading. I said, is that unusual? There was a pause that was slightly longer than a pause needs to be. He said, in 411 years of compact assessment records, this is the first time a subject has completed all 5 stages of the protocol without recording a ceiling cascade. I said, I see. He said, the pre-assessment ceiling probability distribution assigned a 1.3% probability to this outcome. I said, I saw that in the readout before we started. I thought 1.3% seemed conservative. Another pause. He said, may I ask you something, Dr. Solis? I said yes. He said, when you agreed to participate in this assessment knowing the protocol, knowing the design, knowing what Stage 5 was, what did you expect to happen? I thought about this for a moment. It was a fair question. I told him that I had expected what always happened when I pushed hard. The effort costs would climb, the systems would be challenged, the output would be difficult and real, and eventually I would choose to stop because the cost had become more than I wanted to pay on that day. I told him that the thing I had learned, across 30 years of studying human physiology and a parallel 30 years of actually using the body I was studying, was that in humans the question of when to stop is always a cost-benefit negotiation, a conversation between the body's real-time data and the organism's goals, and never a received command. Other species received the command and obeyed it because the command was issued. Humans never received the command because the command infrastructure didn't exist. What humans had instead was a continuous present-tense assessment. Is the cost of continuing acceptable? Is the goal worth the cost? And the answer to that question was never predetermined by chemistry. I told him that I had expected to find at some point in the protocol a cost level I was unwilling to pay. I had not found it today. Drevathon wrote something on the console, a long entry. He wrote for several minutes. The board members had begun, by this point, to speak to each other in low voices, and the Peleth observers had moved to a shared consultation stance and were comparing what I could see were substantial pages of notes. I finished my water. I asked one of the compact staff members if there was more, and there was, and I drank that too. After Drevathon finished writing, he looked up at me. He said, there will be a finding session tomorrow morning. You are invited as the assessed subject to attend and respond to any questions the board has. It is not mandatory. I said I would attend. He said, the assessment data will be preliminarily classified as restricted pending the finding session. That is a standard procedure for, he paused, for novel findings. I asked what the classification level was. He said, research tier 7. Then he said, very evenly, standard classification for data without an existing interpretive framework in compact archives. I asked what the highest research tier was. He said 7. I said, all right. I showered in the facility's staff wing, using the guest accommodation the compact had provided, and I went to the evening meal that had been arranged, which was a small and slightly awkward affair, because 6 of the 7 board members were present, and they all had the quality of people who wanted to ask me questions, and had decided, for professional reasons, that the questions should wait for the finding session. I ate and I answered the small questions. How long had I been running? Did I find the facility comfortable? Was the gradient calibration on the treadmill adequate? And I did my best to be a good dinner companion, which I think I managed reasonably, given the circumstances. Vetharaspel, sitting 2 seats down the table, had regained some of his professional fluency. He asked me carefully about the training history that had preceded the assessment, Not just years of running, the specifics. The gradient work, the interval structure, the periodization. I told him. He listened with the attention of a cardiovascular specialist trying to build a model from the raw inputs. At one point he said, very quietly, "The adaptation you are describing. The metabolic equilibrium at 4.2 millimoles. That is a trained state. That is not a baseline human finding." I told him he was right, and that the follow-up population research would need to address the training adaptation question carefully. What was species characteristic, and what was individual acquired? He said, but the TEM receptor non-functionality, that is not trainable. I said, no, that's anatomy, everyone has it. He went back to his food and did not ask more questions, but he had the look, for the rest of the meal, of a man mentally drafting a research question he intends to submit in the morning. I went back to my accommodation, and I called Dr. Kovalev. She picked up on the second ring. I told her the protocol was complete. She said, and? I said I didn't ceiling. There was a pause, then she said, at all. I said, at all. Stage 5 saturation load, full completion, no cascade. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Marin. I said, yes. She said, they're going to want to do this again, with more subjects. I said I thought she was right. She said, are you all right? I told her I was fine. I told her my legs were tired in a normal, predictable way, and my lactate had cleared during the cool down, and my heart rate at rest was 52, which was within 3 beats of my usual baseline. I told her the most unusual thing about how I felt was that I felt, essentially, how I felt after any hard training day. Tired, satisfied, ready to sleep. She said, Marin, you just broke the compact's entire physiological framework. I told her I knew. She said, how do you feel about that? I told her honestly that I felt hungry, that I had eaten well at the evening meal, but the assessment had been calorically expensive, and I thought a second dinner was warranted. She laughed. It was a strange sound given the context, genuine, a little helpless, the laugh of someone who has spent years arguing about whether a finding was real and has just been told definitively that it was, and has discovered that the answer to that argument is stranger than the argument itself. We talked for 20 minutes. She asked about the board, about Drevathaln, about the Peleth observers. I told her about Orethdim and what he'd said at stage 5's 8th minute. She was very quiet when I told her that. Then she said, he said you were right. I said, he said I was correct. There's a distinction, I think. She said, what's the distinction? I said, being right implies the other person was wrong in a simple way. Being correct is what the data is. I paused. He's a good scientist. He followed his data. The data just took a while to get here. She said she'd tell him I said so if she ever met him. I said, please don't. I slept 8 hours. I always sleep 8 hours. The quality of the sleep after a hard training effort is, I have always found, notably good, the body's restorative processes running at full capacity, the deep sleep windows longer, the recovery architecture doing exactly what it was designed to do. I woke rested. My legs ached in a specific, productive way, the ache of adaptation in progress, the tissue responding to the load. The finding session was held at 9 in the morning, in a smaller chamber adjacent to the calibration suite, and it ran for 4 hours. The board had, overnight, produced a preliminary findings document of 47 pages, which Drevathaln walked me through section by section. The document was thorough, careful, and organized around a central finding. It stated in the compact's formal notation, and then translated for me. The assessed subject had completed the full calibration suite protocol, including the saturation load interval, without recording a terminal effort marker binding event, without entering the physiological shutdown cascade at any stage, and without demonstrating any compensatory or suppressive mechanism that would account for the absence of the cascade. The finding was, in the document's language, Category 1 novel, a finding without precedent in compact assessment records, requiring the creation of a new analytical framework before formal ceiling data could be assigned. The board's question period ran 2 hours. They asked about training history, diet, sleep, baseline physiology, stress history, childhood health events, altitude experience, heat acclimation, pharmacological history. They asked about the prior TEM research, every paper, every methodology choice, every objection in the literature. Vetharaspel's questions covered Stage 2's lactate equilibrium point in technical detail. He had prepared, I could see, a table of comparison data from the Compact's archive, every species that had demonstrated a lactate plateau during Stage 2, and he wanted to understand whether the human plateau was mechanistically similar or categorically different. I told him the plateau mechanism was different. Other species plateaued because they were approaching their ceiling, and the chemistry was beginning to manage the approach. I plateaued because that load was simply within my training range, and my systems were running efficiently. He made a note and then said, after a pause, so the plateau in your case was not a pre-ceiling event. It was a competence event. I said, that's a good way to describe it. He said, we will need a new vocabulary. He was right about that. The Compact's assessment vocabulary had been built entirely around the ceiling model. Every term, every classification, every category of finding assumed that ceiling existed and that the protocol's job was to find it. A finding of ceiling absence required not just a new data category, but a new set of words. The document Drevathaln had prepared was already showing the strain. It used the phrase, non-ceiling outcome, 6 times and the phrase, ceiling absent finding, 4 times, both of which were grammatically awkward in the way that language becomes grammatically awkward when it is describing something it was not built to describe. Orethdim's questions were the most technically detailed, and they were also, I thought, the best questions, the questions of a scientist who has revised his model and is now working to understand the new one as precisely as possible. He spent 40 minutes on the receptor binding assay methodology, walking through each step of my 2019 protocol and my 2021 revision, and by the end of it he had produced in his notation what amounted to a third-generation assay design that addressed 3 sensitivity questions he felt the 2021 version had left partially open. He showed it to me. It was very good work. I told him so. He said, I should have proposed this in 2021. Instead, I wrote a letter to the journal. I said the letter was fair. The objections were real. He said the objections were real and the finding was also real. Both can be true. I said that's most of science. He looked at me for a moment, a long, level look of the kind that passes between 2 scientists who have been on opposite sides of the same data for years and have just arrived, simultaneously, at the same conclusion. And then he went back to his notes. At the session's end, Drevathaln presented the board's formal motion. The motion had 3 parts. The first, that the assessment data be classified at Research Tier 7 and that the classification be reviewed at 6-month intervals. The second, that the Compact formally request a research partnership with the relevant human scientific institutions, specifically to investigate the neurochemical basis of human TEM receptor non-functionality across a population sample, with the Compact providing full facility access and the data archive of all prior species assessments as a comparative reference. The third, that pending the outcome of the population research, the calibration suite protocol be formally annotated to indicate that it does not currently have a validated ceiling assessment methodology for human subjects. I read the third point twice. I asked Drevathaln to confirm what it meant. He said, it means that for human subjects, the protocol does not currently produce a ceiling reading, because no ceiling has been identified. He paused. The annotation will note that this is a data limitation of the current protocol, not a characteristic of the assessed species. I said, but it is a characteristic of the assessed species. He said, yes. I said, you're annotating it as a protocol limitation. He said, very carefully, the compact prefers in its formal documentation to characterize data gaps as methodology limitations rather than species characteristics until a full population study confirms the characteristic. It is a standard practice. I thought about that. Then I said, how many other species assessments have an annotation of this kind? He said, none. He said it with the same inflection he had used at stage 3's end, clinical removal, professional distance. And for a moment I saw him very clearly. A man of considerable professional experience and scientific integrity, working very hard to give the data the framework it deserved while also managing the fact that the data was, in a precise and measurable way, unlike anything the framework had ever been asked to hold. I told him the annotation was fine. I told him the research partnership was something I would need to bring to my institution, but that I expected it to receive approval, and I would say as much in my formal reply. I thanked him for running a thorough assessment. He said, Dr. Solis, I have conducted assessments for 23 years. In that time, I have produced sealing data for 11 species and contributed to the compact's foundational understanding of bipedal physiological limits in a broad cross-section of the known compact. He paused. I have never written a findings document that will require a new data category to be created before it can be formally filed. I said, how does that feel? He said after a moment, like a very long stage 5. I told him I understood exactly what he meant. The compact staff drove me to the transit hub in a courtesy vehicle, and Pelth Savarn was there at the departure lounge to see me off, as he had been at the arrival, and he asked me how the assessment had gone. I told him it had gone well. He looked at me with the expression of a very skilled translator who has just been given a sentence that does not translate easily and is deciding whether to ask for a clarification. He said, I read the preliminary findings summary this morning. Drevathan shared it with the liaison office as a courtesy. I said, yes. He said, it uses the phrase unprecedented outcome 4 times in 47 pages. I said, that sounds about right. He said, Dr. Solis, I have been a liaison officer for the compact for 18 years. I have facilitated assessments for 7 species. In every case, the subject came in, completed the protocol to whatever stage their biology permitted, and went home with a sealing reading. The compact filed the data. The data sat in the archive. The species was, from that point, understood. He paused. You are the first subject I have facilitated who is going home without a sealing reading. I told him I was sorry for the administrative inconvenience. He said slowly, I am not sure that is what I mean. He looked at me for a moment. I mean that the compact has spent 400 years answering the question of where species end, and you are going home as an open question. I thought about this, then I said, Pelth Savarn, every species you've assessed. They came in, ran the protocol, received their sealing reading, and went home. And then? He said, and then the data sat in the archive. I said, did the compact change anything about how it dealt with those species, based on the sealing data? He thought about it, he said, calibrated its risk models, adjusted certain partnership protocols, standard policy applications. I said, and the species themselves, did knowing their sealing change how they worked with you? He said, generally no, they had the data, they could do what they wished with it. I said, so the sealing reading told the compact where the species ended, but the species didn't particularly change on the basis of being told where they ended. He said, that is accurate. I said, I am going home without a sealing reading. The compact doesn't know where I end. Neither do I, I've never known. I picked up my bag. That's not new information, Pelth Savarn, it's just now documented. He was still working on that one when I boarded my transit. The research partnership that the board's motion proposed was approved by my institution 4 months later. Dr. Kovalov led the human side of the collaboration. The compact contributed full facility access, and as promised, their complete archive, every species assessment, every ceiling reading, every methodology note from 411 years of work. The research partnership's first paper, published 3 years after my assessment, confirmed in a population sample of 412 human subjects, athletes, non-athletes, elderly, young, across a range of fitness levels and demographics, that human TEM receptor structures are universally present and universally non-functional. The finding held across every subject in the sample. Every human tested completed stage 3, 91% completed stage 4, 67% completed stage 5, 14% completed the saturation load interval. Nobody ceilinged. The paper's conclusion section ran to 11 pages. The lead finding was the non-functional TEM receptor data, confirmed across the population. The secondary finding was one that neither Kovalov's team nor the compact had fully anticipated. The absence of a ceiling mechanism does not produce uniformly higher performance. What it produces is uniformly extended negotiation. Human subjects do not hit a wall. They conduct at every stage of the protocol a continuous internal assessment of cost and goal. They stop when they stop because the cost has become acceptable to stop at, not because the chemistry demands it. This means that human performance ceiling is not a fixed biological datum. It is a function of the specific human on the specific day, under the specific circumstances, with the specific goal in front of them. It varies. It is not stable. It cannot be filed in an archive and referenced reliably. The compact's data team read the second finding twice, and then submitted a formal query to the research partnership, asking whether it was possible to produce a stable ceiling figure for humans under a defined set of motivational and contextual parameters. Dr. Kovalov wrote back to say that was an interesting question and that they were working on it. They published a follow-up paper 18 months later. Its conclusion: under standardized conditions, human performance ceiling is bounded at the lower end by physiology, substrate depletion, structural damage thresholds, temperature regulation limits, and at the upper end by the degree to which the individual has decided on that day that the goal is worth the cost. The lower bound is real, measurable, and consistent. The upper bound is not a biological fixed point. It is a choice. The compact's formal annotation to the calibration suite protocol was updated after the first partnership paper. The new annotation, as Drevathan shared it with me in a personal message, read: human subjects, ceiling assessment not currently producible, TEM receptor structures confirmed present and non-functional across assessed population. Standard protocol produces no ceiling cascade in any tested subject. Assessment data should be classified as open dataset pending development of species-specific methodology. I read it twice. I thought about the 411-year archive. I thought about Drevathan at stage 3's end. I thought about Orethdem at stage 5's 8th minute, writing in his notebook, revising a model he had held for many years. I wrote back to Drevathan and told him the annotation looked right to me. He wrote back to say that the compact's archive now had, for the first time in its history, a species without a ceiling entry. He said the data team had spent some time deciding where in the archive to file the open dataset. They had eventually created a new category. He told me what the category was called. It was called in the compact's formal taxonomy, limit unknown. I saved that message. I have it still, on the same device I had the day I read it, sitting in a folder I open occasionally when I want to remember something clearly. My legs had been tired for about 3 days after the assessment. Normal, predictable. By the 4th day they were fine. I ran 12 kilometers that morning.